Daniel's son deserves his inheritance, my sister announced to my horrified family. I felt my heart stop, not from grief, but from the chilling memory of a doctor's words to my husband years ago. The procedure was a complete success. You are irreversibly sterile. My name is Victoria, and I'm speaking to you tonight from my quiet home here in Savannah, Georgia, where the air is thick and the oak trees look like old, grieving widows. 6 months ago, I was one of them. At 38, I found myself burying my husband, Daniel, the man who was my entire world. The shock of his sudden heart attack was a storm that leveled everything I knew. But the hurricane that followed, the one that truly threatened to tear my life down to its foundation, was my own sister, Valerie. At the formal reading of Daniel's will, in front of his heartbroken parents, Valerie calmly presented a document. It claimed that her 2-year-old son, Leo, was actually Daniel's child, and that he was entitled to the entirety of his $2 million life insurance policy. As the lawyer's office fell into a stunned, horrified silence, everyone turned to see me shatter. But I didn't. A strange, cold calm washed over me as I looked at the sister I thought I knew. I saw the calculated performance in her eyes, the greedy tremor in her hand as she held that piece of paper. I didn't scream or break down because I knew a secret, a deeply personal medical secret Daniel and I had shared, one that made her entire, devastating claim not just a lie, but a physical impossibility. If you're watching this from somewhere, maybe late at night when the world is quiet, and you've ever felt a betrayal so deep it stole your breath, just tap that like button to let me know I'm not alone. I knew in that moment this wasn't just about grief anymore, it was a fight for Daniel's memory. That lawyer's office, with its dark wood paneling and the scent of old paper, suddenly felt like a courtroom where my husband was being put on trial after his death. Valerie had prepared her speech, her voice dripping with a practiced, counterfeit grief. It was a moment of weakness for both of us, she said, placing a hand over her heart. We never meant to hurt you, Victoria. Daniel was just so conflicted. He loved you, but we shared something special. She claimed they'd had a brief, passionate affair 2 years prior, that my sweet, devoted Daniel had lived a double life. Daniel's mother, a fragile woman who had already lost her only son, let out a sound of pure agony. His father, a man I'd only ever seen cry once, stared at Valerie with a look of utter disbelief and disgust. They were trying to process the impossible, that their honorable son was a liar and a cheat. But I saw through the performance. I saw the flicker of triumph in her eyes when my mother-in-law started to cry. This wasn't the confession of a remorseful woman, it was the calculated move of a predator. She painted a picture of secret meetings at riverside hotels and whispered promises. A whole fantasy world designed to shatter my reality. And as she spoke, spinning this web of deceit, I felt my grief morph into something else, something hard and sharp and focused. It was the birth of a cold, clear resolve. Right now, no matter where you are, I want you to think about this. Would you confront the lie right there in the room, or would you walk away to plan your next move? Type confront or plan in the comments below. In that moment, surrounded by my family's shock and sorrow, I knew I had to choose my battlefield very carefully. Valerie slid the single sheet of paper across the mahogany table toward our family lawyer, Mr. Harrison, but her eyes were locked on me. The document was supposed to be her checkmate, the irrefutable proof that would validate her story and secure her payday. I could almost feel the heat of a home printer still radiating from it. The whole thing was an amateurish mess. Daniel, a meticulous academic, would have been appalled by the formatting alone. The legal language was a clumsy collage, likely stitched together from a dozen different websites, full of contradictory clauses and misplaced jargon. It was an insult to the brilliant, careful man he had been. But the most glaring, most offensive part was the signature at the bottom. She must have found a sample of his signature online, maybe from a university publication, and traced it. She'd tried to capture the confident loop of his D and the sharp, definitive cross of the L at the end of his name. But it was a clumsy imitation. The pressure was uneven, the lines hesitant where Daniel's had been fluid and certain. I had held his hand for 12 years. I knew its every movement. I'd watched him sign our marriage certificate, our mortgage, the hundreds of loving cards he'd given me. That shaky scrawl at the bottom of the page was not my husband's signature. It was a crude forgery, a desperate grasping at a life he had built and a fortune he had earned. As I stared at it, the initial shock in the room began to fade, replaced by my own silent, hardening certainty. This wasn't just a lie. It was a poorly executed crime. And she was going to have to answer for it. Every eye in that suffocating room was fixed on me. They were waiting for the explosion, for the dam of my grief to break into a torrent of screams and accusations. Daniel's mother was already pushing her chair back, ready to rush to my side and console the hysterical widow. But the hysteria never came. Instead, as I looked at Valerie's smug, expectant face, a strange thing happened. The corner of my mouth twitched upwards into a small, sad smile. It wasn't a smile of amusement. It was the weary, disbelieving smile of someone witnessing a tragedy so absurd it bordered on farce. My sister, my own flesh and blood, had built this elaborate stage, cast herself as the victim, and my dead husband as the villain. But she had forgotten one critical detail, one fact so fundamental that it made her entire play fall apart before it had even truly begun. My reaction clearly unnerved her. Her confident posture stiffened, and a flicker of doubt crossed her face. She had expected tears, a messy, emotional scene she could control. She was not prepared for quiet, unshakable composure. My in-laws exchanged worried glances, likely believing I had finally snapped under the pressure, my mind fractured by grief. They couldn't know that my calm wasn't madness, it was clarity. I was holding on to a secret Daniel and I had sworn to keep, a deeply private medical decision we made 5 years ago. It was a truth so powerful and absolute that it acted as a shield, deflecting all her poisonous lies. Have you ever had a moment where you knew the whole truth, but had to stay silent and just let the chaos unfold around you? It's a strange kind of power, isn't it? I let them all think I was breaking, but in reality, I had never been stronger. As the ugly present faded, my mind retreated to the safety of the past. It fled back 12 years, to a sweltering July afternoon on a quiet, cobblestone lane. I was a young architect, sketching the crumbling facade of a historic home I was helping to restore. Daniel, then a new history professor at the university, had been walking by and stopped, intrigued not by the house, but by my focus. He didn't just see a building, he saw the stories in its bones, and from that first moment, he saw me in the same way. Our love story unfolded against the backdrop of Savannah's timeless beauty. We bought our own beautiful, dilapidated house near Forsyth Park and spent years pouring our love and labor into its walls, sanding floors, and planting gardenias in the yard. Our life wasn't grand or dramatic. It was a quiet masterpiece built of shared dreams, late-night talks, and his unwavering belief in me. But there was a silent sorrow woven into our perfect life. We wanted children more than anything. For 5 years, we endured the grueling, soul-crushing marathon of fertility treatments. The endless doctor's appointments, the painful injections, the hope that rose and fell with every monthly cycle. Each negative test was a fresh grief we bore together. That shared struggle, that quiet battle we fought as a team, forged a bond of trust and transparency so profound that it left no room for secrets. We were each other's confidants in our deepest pain. The idea that he would have an affair, that he would father a child with someone else, especially my own sister, wasn't just an insult to his character. It was a desecration of the sacred, painful journey we had traveled together. It was a story so fundamentally wrong. I knew it could never be true. Our life was a sanctuary, but even a sanctuary can have a serpent. My sister, Valerie, was a constant, unsettling presence at the edge of our happiness. 4 years younger than me, she had always viewed my life not as something to celebrate, but as a benchmark to compete against. While I was building a career, she was collecting grievances, drifting between part-time jobs and short-lived passions, always with an air of artistic tragedy that our parents found endearing and I found exhausting. Her admiration for my life always felt tainted with a sharp, bitter envy. When Daniel and I announced our engagement, she immediately started dating a law student. When we finally bought our home, she spent an entire holiday dinner lamenting the injustice of her cramped one-bedroom apartment. After we were married, this strange rivalry took on a much darker and more personal dimension. Her focus shifted to Daniel. She saw him not as my husband, but as the ultimate prize she needed to win. At family gatherings, Her compliments toward him were always a little too effusive, her laughter a little too loud when he spoke. Her touch would linger on his arm just a second too long. Then came the night I knew something was truly wrong. I had stepped away to take a client call, and when I came back, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Daniel later told me, his voice full of discomfort, that Valerie had made a pass at him. She'd suggested that I was too consumed with my own sad little fertility project, and that he deserved a woman who could give him more. He shut her down firmly, of course, and from that day on, we kept a careful, polite distance. But I see now that it wasn't just a clumsy, drunken pass. It was a declaration of intent. I was willing to let it go. I wanted to believe it was just a sad, isolated incident fueled by too much wine and a lifetime of insecurity. Family is complicated, and I wanted peace. But Daniel, my brilliant, methodical husband, saw it differently. He was a historian. He studied patterns in human behavior for a living. And he saw a dangerous pattern forming in Valerie. I remember him sitting with me in our garden a few days later, the scent of jasmine heavy in the air. "Tori," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "People like your sister, they don't just stop. When they don't get the reaction they want, they don't reflect, they escalate. This isn't about me, it's about her deep-seated need to disrupt your happiness." He wasn't speaking out of anger, but out of a calm, chilling certainty. He told me he didn't want to cause a family feud, but he felt an overwhelming need to protect me, to protect us, from whatever might come next. That afternoon, he sat down at his desk and began a private journal. He documented the date and details of Valerie's advance. He started saving screenshots of her increasingly passive-aggressive text messages. At the time, it felt a bit extreme, almost clinical. I even told him he was being a little paranoid, but he just looked at me with those kind, steady eyes and said, "It's better to have a map and not need it than to be lost in the woods without one." It's almost 11 p.m. on a Saturday night here. I wonder what time it is where you're at. Have you ever had a gut instinct so strong that it pushed you to do something that seemed paranoid at the time, only to be grateful for it later? I didn't know it then, but my wise, loving husband was drawing me a map out of the darkest woods I would ever have to navigate. Daniel's journal was one layer of his protection, a shield forged from intuition. But the ultimate, unbreachable fortress that would defend his honor wasn't an action he took because of my sister. It was a decision forced upon us by fate, a painful chapter in our story that we had shared with no one. About a year after Valerie's inappropriate advance, Daniel began suffering from a persistent, debilitating pain. After a series of tests, he was diagnosed with a severe medical condition that required immediate and complex surgery. The procedure was primarily to alleviate his pain and prevent future health crises, but it came with a difficult non-negotiable recommendation from his surgeon. Due to the extensive nature of the surgery and the high risk of future complications, the doctor advised that a vasectomy be performed at the same time. It wasn't a choice about family planning. It was a matter of Daniel's long-term health. For a couple that had already grieved the children we couldn't conceive, being told that the door was now being permanently bolted shut was a unique kind of agony. It was the universe delivering a final, definitive verdict on a dream we had secretly still clung to. We sat in that cold, sterile office, holding hands so tightly our knuckles were white, and we agreed. His health was all that mattered. The surgery went perfectly, and so did the vasectomy. We never told a soul, not our parents, not our closest friends. We were tired of our bodies and our hopes being a topic of discussion at family dinners. This last, painful piece of our journey was ours alone. It was a secret born of medical necessity and sealed by our shared grief. And it was this secret, this absolute, medically documented fact, that made my sister's claims in that lawyer's office not just a lie, but a biological impossibility. The day after the will reading, I didn't waste time with tears. I drove straight to the downtown branch of our bank, the city's historic district, a blur of wrought iron and weeping willows outside my car window. Daniel had set up a safe deposit box years ago, shortly after his surgery. He called it his contingency file, and I had the second key. At the time, I thought it was just for practical things, deeds, passports, our marriage license. I never imagined it would one day hold the keys to defending his very soul. The bank vault was cold, the air still and heavy. As the clerk left me alone in the small, sterile viewing room, I placed the cool metal box on the table and took a steadying breath before turning the key. It was like opening a time capsule of my husband's love and foresight. Everything was organized with his signature precision. On top was his actual will, legally drafted by our attorney, leaving everything we had built together to me. Beneath it, in a sealed manila envelope marked Medical Private, were the certified hospital records, the surgeon's report, the anesthesiologist's notes, and the follow-up lab results confirming the vasectomy was a complete success. Then, I saw the familiar dark blue, leather-bound journal I knew he kept. And finally, at the very bottom, was a thick, cream-colored envelope with my name, Victoria, written in his beautiful, flowing script. My heart ached seeing his handwriting. It was a letter from beyond the grave. On a scale of 1 to 10, how important is it to you that your partner is someone who thinks ahead? Someone who would quietly build a fortress to protect you from a storm they saw coming miles away? Let me know in the comments. In that cold, silent room, holding the proof of his love and the evidence of his integrity, I was no longer a grieving widow. I was his chosen defender. Armed with Daniel's foresight, I met with our family attorney, a sharp, kind man named Marcus Thorne who had known Daniel since his early days at the university. I laid out the contents of the safe deposit box on his polished conference table. He examined the forged will Valerie had presented, his expression hardening with professional indignation. "This is an egregious act of fraud, Victoria," he said, his voice low and steady. "But before we act, we need to understand the why. Desperate people do desperate, foolish things. We need the full picture." He recommended a private investigator, a former detective named Frank Miller, a man known for his discretion and his relentless pursuit of the truth. I agreed without hesitation. It was time to turn over the rocks in my sister's life and see what crawled out. Frank's report came back less than 72 hours later, and it was a portrait of utter desperation. Valerie was drowning in over $90,000 of debt. Credit cards were maxed out. There were unpaid medical bills for my nephew, Leo, who had a chronic respiratory condition, and she was 3 months behind on rent, with an eviction notice set to take effect in less than 2 weeks. Her son's father, a musician she'd briefly dated, had moved to Oregon months ago and had effectively vanished, contributing nothing. But the most sickening discovery was a series of text messages Frank had recovered, a conversation between Valerie and a friend. The messages laid out her plan with chilling clarity. "Daniel's death is my only way out," one read. "That insurance policy is our ticket." I found a copy of his signature online. "It's a long shot, but Tori is so broken right now, she'll just want to make it all go away." It wasn't a crime of passion or a spontaneous lie. It was a cold, premeditated assault on my grief. This had all changed. It was no longer about defending Daniel's memory or restoring family honor. It had become a calculated chess match. I called Valerie and requested a meeting. "We need to talk about the will," I said, my voice cold and distant. "Come to the house, alone." I could hear the smug satisfaction in her voice. She believed my grief had finally softened me into submission. She arrived the next afternoon, looking arrogantly confident in a new outfit. I had set the stage. Daniel's study, where his presence still felt palpable. On the oak desk between us, I placed 2 simple folders. Before we discuss any money, I began, sliding the first folder toward her. "I want you to see this." It was Daniel's complete medical file. The color drained from Valerie's face as she read the cold, clinical words: vasectomy, 0 sperm count, irreversibly sterile. Her multi-million-dollar fantasy was dissolving in her hands. This could be fake," she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. I pushed the second folder across the desk. "And this is the private investigator's report, detailing your $90,000 debt, your eviction notice, and these text messages. We have reached a crossroads, you and I. What door would you have shown Valerie in this moment? The one to compassion or the one to consequence? Tell me in the comments below." I looked my sister dead in the eye and said, "The performance is over, Valerie. The only question now is what this final act is going to look like." For a long moment, the only sound in the study was the grandfather clock ticking in the hall, each tick measuring the seconds of her world falling apart. The arrogant woman who had walked into my house 30 minutes earlier was gone. In her place was a stranger, hollowed out and transparent. The mask of the grieving mistress shattered, and all that was left was the desperate, terrified girl I remembered from our childhood, the one who would break my favorite toys and then weep when she was caught. And then came the tears. Not the performative, theatrical sobs she used to manipulate our parents, but ugly, gasping sobs that shook her entire body. It was the sound of a cornered animal, the sound of utter defeat. I didn't know what else to do. She finally choked out, the words tumbling out between ragged breaths. The eviction is in 2 weeks. Leo's medical bills. Tyler is gone. I'm going to be on the street. She confessed everything. She admitted that Daniel had never laid a hand on her, that he had, in her words, been annoyingly devoted to me. She admitted her graphic designer friend had pieced together the fake will after they found a sample of Daniel's signature on a charity gala program online. I thought you'd be so lost in your grief you'd pay me to go away, she whispered, her voice raw. I never thought you'd fight back this hard. There was no satisfaction in her confession, no thrill of victory for me. Just the pathetic, hollow echo of a lifetime of jealousy finally laid bare on the floor of my dead husband's study. I let the sound of her sobbing fill the silence of the study. My lawyer's words echoed in my mind. Forgery, fraud, extortion, felonies. I held a deck of cards that could send my own sister to prison for years. The wounded part of me, the wife who had just buried her husband, wanted to play that hand. I wanted to see her face the cold, hard consequences of the law. But then, an image of my nephew, Leo, flashed in my mind. A sweet, innocent 2-year-old with his father's bright eyes and a recurring lung condition, a little boy already abandoned by one parent. What justice would be served if I allowed him to lose his mother, too? He was the one truly blameless victim in this entire disaster. I'm not going to call the police, I said finally, my voice steady. A wave of pathetic relief washed over her face, but I cut it short. Don't misunderstand me. This isn't forgiveness. This is a lifeline, and it comes with very firm conditions. I laid out my terms. First, she would confess everything to our parents. Second, I would establish a trust fund, managed by my lawyer, that would cover Leo's medical bills and future education. Not a single dollar would ever pass through her hands. I would help her secure a new, modest apartment, but she would have to get a steady job to pay the rent. And third, she would begin mandatory therapy and financial counseling. This is the part of the story that still troubles me. When an innocent child's welfare is on the line, does it change what justice should look like? I would really appreciate hearing your perspective on this in the comments. These are my terms, I concluded. You follow them to the letter, or this lifeline disappears, and all this evidence goes directly to the district attorney. The choice is yours, Valerie. Valerie, left with no alternative, accepted my conditions. That weekend, I arranged a dinner at my house. My parents arrived bearing a homemade pie and their signature brand of willful blindness to the tensions in their own family. The air was thick with a silence that no amount of small talk from my mother could fill. After we had pushed the food around on our plates for a sufficient amount of time, I looked at Valerie and nodded. Her confession this time was different. It was quiet, monotone, and stripped of all the dramatic flair she usually employed. She laid it all bare: the crushing debt, Tyler's abandonment, the forged will, and the monstrous lie about Daniel. My father sat there, his face a mask of pale, stunned disappointment. But my mother's reaction was exactly what I had expected and dreaded. Her first instinct was not to admonish Valerie, but to manage my reaction. "Oh, honey," she said to my sister, her voice dripping with pity. Then, she turned to me. "Victoria, you can see how desperate she was. She made a terrible mistake, but you can't hold this over her head. We're a family. We have to forgive and move on from this." In that single moment, I saw the root of the problem so clearly. It wasn't just Valerie's jealousy. It was my parents' lifetime of enabling it. "No," I said, my voice quiet but unyielding. "We are not moving on. What she did was a felony, Mom. And your immediate need to excuse it is why we're sitting here. The enabling ends tonight. The bailouts, the looking the other way, it's over. That's a non-negotiable part of the deal." For the first time in my life, I wasn't just confronting my sister, I was redrawing the boundaries for my entire family. It's been a year since that tense family dinner, a year of quiet, difficult rebuilding. The foundations of our family, which I had discovered were rotten with secrets and enabling, had to be torn down before anything new could be built. To everyone's surprise, most of all mine, Valerie has adhered to the terms of our agreement. She's been in consistent therapy, working through the issues that have haunted her for a lifetime. She holds a steady job as a receptionist at a veterinary clinic, and while our relationship is not warm or sisterly in the way it once pretended to be, it is honest. It's built on the solid ground of boundaries, and we navigate it carefully for the sake of her son. And Leo has become the unexpected joy that has risen from the ashes of this ordeal. The trust ensures he has the best medical care for his asthma, and I see him every Saturday. We spend our days at the Georgia State Railroad Museum or building sandcastles at Tybee Island. In his bright, curious eyes, I see a future, a connection to family that I thought had been severed forever. As for me, I honored my husband in the only way I knew how. I established the Daniel Miller Foundation for Architectural Preservation, a fund that gives scholarships to students passionate about saving the historic buildings he so deeply loved. His name is now carved onto a plaque in the university's history department, a legacy of integrity and passion, forever silencing the ugly lies my sister tried to attach to his memory. I couldn't save my husband, but I was able to save his name, and, in the process, I started to save myself. So that is the story of the hardest year of my life. It began with the deepest grief I have ever known and was followed by a betrayal that threatened to destroy everything I had left. But in the end, I've come to see it as a story about love. Not just the beautiful, everyday love I shared with Daniel, but a fierce, protective love that he armed me with. A love so thoughtful it reached back from the afterlife to defend me when I was at my most vulnerable. His foresight taught me one of the most profound lessons I have ever learned. That sometimes, the most loving thing you can do for yourself, and even for your family, is to build a boundary. Boundaries are not meant to punish. They are meant to preserve. They are the quiet, firm lines we draw around our peace, our integrity, and our hearts to protect what is sacred. The woman I am today is not the same woman who sat in that lawyer's office a year ago. The grief and the deceit carved new lines on my soul, but they also uncovered a reservoir of strength I never knew existed. I learned that healing is not about forgetting. The scars of this past year are a part of me now. They are a map of my survival. And as I sit here tonight, in the house that Daniel and I filled with so much love, I feel a sense of peace that I thought was lost to me forever. The grief is now a quiet companion, not a crushing weight. There is hope on the horizon. And there is the quiet promise of a new chapter, one that I will write for myself, on my own terms. Thank you for spending this time with me and for listening with such open hearts. If this story resonated with you, and if you believe in the power of rewriting our own narratives after a storm, I'd be so honored if you would subscribe and become part of this community. Your presence here reminds me that even in our most private battles, we are never truly alone.